everyone. Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters restoration. So guess who's back? Brent Ashworth. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Steve.
So this is our continuing segment of where we discuss various items in Brent's collection. We're entitling it Show and Tell, which is kind of a play on, it's actually kind of named after his book, which, by the way, folks, is limited availability of the hardcover, but hopefully there will be a soft cover down the road. So keep that in mind. So basically what with this little series we're doing is Brent is going to present something that's Mormon related. I don't know what's coming up until he shows it on the camera. And I think it just keeps me on my feet, just, make sure I'm on top of my game here. Right. So basically I just want to, I'm excited to see what the third item is. So let's just bring it out.
Okay. Well, thank you for letting me show these things. They're kind of fun. This is a newspaper clipping. It's the first advertisement for the Book of Mormon.
Oh, wow.
And it was published in the Wayne-Sentinal, March 26, 1830. Now, let me read it to you. Wayne-Sentinel was the newspaper in Pynakker. E.B. Grandin published it. It was also the one that Obadiah Dogberry challenged some by reprinting some pieces from the Book of Mormon using the same type. But this is the original ad, and under the heading, The Book of Mormon, it says, an account written by the hand of Mormon upon plates taken from the plates of Nephi. Wherefore it is an abridgment of the record of the people of Nephi and also of the Lamanites, written to the Lamanites, which are a remnant of the house of Israel, and to the Jew and Gentile. Well, I'm reading from what was the title page of the Book of Mormon. The title page was the original advertisement for the book. And the first printing of the ad was, it was carried in the paper for 3 weeks, but the first one was this one, which is March 26, 1830. At the bottom, it says the above work, containing about 600 pages, large duodecimos, now for sale, wholesale and retail at the Pynakker bookstore by E.B. Grandin, Pynakker, March 26, 1830. The interesting part of that title page is the part that often gets quoted by critics. It says the book was by Joseph Smith Jr. in all caps, author and proprietor.
Right.
Well, under New York law at the time, there were no provisions for a translator. So you're either the author or you to get your book published. So when they got to Ohio and they ran out of those 5,000 copies, or they were pretty well worn out, which was a huge undertaking at the time for a little bookstore in Pynakker, New York. That'd be more than what they usually published in an edition in New York City. But when they ran out of them and they got to Ohio, Kirtland, it was decided by the committee to republish the book in 1837. And there were no such stipulations in Ohio law, so Joseph Smith didn't have to be the author and the proprietor. But anyway, that's the way he's listed there in the very first ad. Now that ad was picked up by a number of papers, including Thurlow Weed's. And this is Thurlow Weed's paper. Now, if you know his name in history, he was a famous American. He was a postmaster general. He'd been involved in governments later on in his career. But at this point, he was a newspaper publisher. And he was one of the people that Joseph Smith took Martin Harris to visit when they couldn't get Grandin to print the book. Grandin originally turned them down, as you recall. And they went elsewhere. And one of the places they went was to Thurlow Weed and to the Rochester Daily Advertiser. But Weed, in a letter which I have, which I didn't bring today, but he says that he proudly turned it down, thinking it wasn't anything he wanted to be involved with. But he did pick up the paper on March 29th, 1830. I don't know if you can see the date. Mm-hmm. 3 days later. It was pretty quick for a newspaper to pick up another, but it's March 29th, 1830. Now, when you keep in mind that this is exactly 1 week before the church was organized, which is April 6th, 1830, it kind of puts it in some perspective. The news then, usually in most papers of that day, advertisements, runaway slave ads, and other kinds of juicy news which made money were put on the front page. That was the most important part of the newspaper, was the advertising. Later, the advertising ended up being put in other locations, but generally in the 19th century, a lot of those start out there. So the news the news is really relegated to the second and later pages. And I don't know if you can see the heading in Thurlow Weed's paper, but he says, a new way of raising the wind. Okay, let me read that paragraph he's written. He's just got news of the book being published. It is frequently remarked that any scheme, however gross, will find more or less dupes. The accuracy of the saying is, it seems, by the following advertisement from the Wayne-Sentinal, to be now tested anew in this region of excitements, quote unquote. And then you've got the Book of Mormon, an account written by the hand of Mormon. So you've got the title page repeated and going all the way down. At this particular time, it says the above work containing about 600 pages, large duodecimos, now for sale, wholesale and retail at the Palmyra bookstore by Howard and Grandin. The original had E.B. Grandin. But any rate, a new way of raising the wind. That's the way Thurlow Weed described it when it came to his paper.
So he basically gave them free advertising for their book, but he added his commentary.
Yeah. He put it in his vernacular, his reaction. But at any rate, these are the beginnings of the ads for the Book of Mormon, and I think they're kind of fun because, as we know, the title page was used as the first ad for the Book of Mormon, and these were the first examples of that. The statement that Weed makes, a new way of inheriting the wind, the thing did fly by the wind. I mean, literally, people were trying to get a hold of this new scripture when they heard about it. It was very, very popular. And we know, for instance, that some people, if you want to say, were converted by the book itself without missionaries. We think of the Latter-day Saints sending missionaries out 2 by 2 around the world. Now, when I was at the MTC years ago as a branch, branch presidency, I used to tell the missionaries that, one of your greatest missionaries is just a book, because I think as you read the Book of Mormon, in my opinion, it's like reading the Bible. You can get the Spirit can testify to you as to its truthfulness. So, in my opinion, it's another evidence of the truthfulness of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So this is how the message first got out. It was first advertised by using the title page, and the book was for sale, wholesale and retail. There have been a lot of studies done that the book was put out originally at $1 a volume, or $1.75 or $1.25, whatever it was. I read, I had John Taylor's journal before I gave it to the church years ago. And in that, he quotes Solomon Chamberlain as saying that you tried to get $1 for him, but if you could get a quarter, you were doing great. So, the book was an expensive book to print, but it became even harder to sell. People didn't have means. So usually if they got a hold of the Book of Mormon, it went through a number of families' hands, just like the one Brigham Young got from his big brother Phineas Young, and so on. And most first edition Book of Mormons are really not marked up. Very few are ever signed or anything, and but definitely very few are marked up, and that's because they went through so many hands. Well, the Bible's very similar that way, but generally in the Bible you do have pages that are dedicated to putting in your genealogy and so on, so that helps that. But anyway, it's fascinating how this humble little clipping started the advertisements for a book, which has now been printed over 150 million times.
So that's basically the very first announcement to the world about the book officially. Okay, so that's really fascinating. So how did you get your hands on that piece?
Well, many years ago, I collect newspapers too, and I've got thousands of old newspapers. So I've always been fascinated in them. To me, they're kind of like letters, because there's so few copies of some of them that you almost never see another copy of particular ones. These that I've shown you here are very rare, even though you'd think they'd be saved, and all the moves the church made, very few of them ever got saved. And so I got them from actually a one of them I got from a dealer that I called my mentor. He's passed away now, Niall Anderson, in Salt Lake City. He had a store called Beehive Collectors Gallery, remember, for many years in Salt Lake, and he had this piece, and I purchased it from him, and I felt honored to get it. He'd held it for many, many years. He died in his 90s, about 2016, but he was kind of one of my mentors, so that's where I got that.
So basically, somebody took the time to cut that ad out of the paper, right? And then preserve it. So who would have, how far back do we know where this came from? Do we know who cut it out?
No, not
Okay.
exactly. We don't. That's a good question. But the fact that it was mounted on cardboard early on, so somebody thought it was important enough,
Oh,
to do that. The cardboard's old. It's kind of like the cardboard they put photographs on back in the 19th century. So we do know that it's authentic. It's real. Somebody saved it. It wasn't perfectly clipped out right, and it's actually got some pencil notation on the top corner there around Book of Mormon.
oh yes.
So it's been clipped on purpose. I have a collection that we might show one time if we have time. It's kind of large, but it's a Brigham Young scrapbook, and it's got over 3,000 clippings like this in it that were all taken overland at the time out here in Utah. From actually, it started from when they first got here till about 1855. Newspapers and their clippings were very important because they were about the only news they could get at certain times. The only places they could record things other than publishing a book.
So back then, was that generally how newspaper clippings were preserved? They were mounted on cardboard like that?
Sometimes they were mounted to preserve them on cardboard. Sometimes they were put in scrapbooks, many times. Like I say, the Brigham Young scrapbook is quite large. It's a little unwieldy for Zoom. I had a box built for it that's yay big, but it's got over 3,000 clippings. It was actually my father, when he was alive, it was his favorite piece that I had. We used to have it out on the dining room table. I loved going through the clippings because like this, they had notes, or Brigham Young would write on them. His particular scrapbook was divided into sections where the clippings had to do with fulfillment of prophecies, for instance. Some disaster in the world, like earthquake blows up on an island, Khartoum or something. It's recorded. Some ship goes down with 300 souls. It's on there. Some terrible storm somewhere. It's recorded. Then you have blank pages in between, and you have his speeches as they got sent back to him by Eastern newspapers. They would get clipped out by his secretaries and pasted in this section of it. And then you'd have sections that would be on what he felt like was future prophecies, things that were in the news that he thought would lead to, like civil war or something years down the road. So he divided his up. It was a fun piece. I'll have to show you that if we can at some point.
Okay.
But newspaper clippings are very important, and they were saved because newspapers themselves just generally weren't saved, unless they were combined in a big book or something, which I have a number of those too. But
so I remember as a little kid growing up, I'd watch a lot of these prophecy shows, and they'd be saying, you can read in the world news is like reading the Book of Revelation. They can read them together.
Sure,
and Brigham Young was doing the same thing.
Yeah, he was doing the same thing in the 1850s. So, sure.
Wow, that's pretty wild. So this ad, okay, in that particular edition, is there a complete newspaper that has that somebody has in a collection that has that ad in it and the complete paper with it as well?
Well, I'm sure there is. The church probably has a complete one of the Wayne-Sentinal.
Okay.
Like I say, this is a complete one of.
That's a complete one there.
Yeah, and so this is Thurlow Weed who turned down publishing it. So he had added that little paragraph, but it's complete.
Okay, that's complete. And how many of these clippings of this ad are you aware of that are out there?
I'm not aware of any others in private hands.
Okay.
There may be, but I'm not. In 65 years of collecting these, are the only ones of these two I've seen. So.
Wow. Oh, that's really
So the
interesting.
church must have a complete or partial Wayne-Sentinel with that in. It may not be the first issue, but it was published for 3 consecutive weeks. So,
Right. So there's at least one of those editions
uh,
they probably have a complete. I'd
so,
love
but
to see if
and
there's actually
there's probably some university library back east or something that has some. But as far as private collectors and private hands, these are the only ones I've seen of these
wow,
two.
wow, that's really interesting. Um, I'm just curious, like, you've been collecting and for a very long time, and it sounds to me like it's a pretty close knit community where you like there's a lot of stuff, conversations going on in background about, hey, I'm hearing this is out here. Of course, and of course, we all know from Murder Among the Mormons and Mark Hofman's stories, he would put some of those stories out there. But just
Sure.
tell me, in light of what everything happened with Mark Hofman, how do these conversations go when you're talking about like an item that you're not quite sure? You're hearing something about it, but now of course you're more sensitive to the fact that there are frauds out there as well.
Well, we've relied a lot more since Mark. One thing we did learn was that genealogy or provenance is important.
Mm.
And so, as far as we can go back on an item, it's like on these clippings, we don't know the beginning of who cut it out, but we do know some of the substantial collectors and dealers that had them, during the years or institutions, and that helps. It helps along the way too to have an expertise or a little bit of an understanding as to what are reprints and what are originals of different things. The Book of Mormon, for instance, is one that's been reprinted a number of times. Sometimes they've even reset the type. I have one which has an authentic page stuck into a copy that was all reset type years ago. It was done in 2007. I was looking at it the other day. Beautifully done. Of course, the pages are white. They're not aged, except for the one original page, which they stuck in the middle of the book just to show where it fit. But yeah, you can usually tell. There are a lot of things about type and so on over the years that have changed, and about the paper that have changed. That was the problem with Hofman, is that he would get original in sheets of newspapers and do his letters and so on that, so that the paper would pass inspection. And he took it a bigger step, and that was that he knew the inks that they used. And I mentioned the iron gall ink when you were out here, that had a particular ingredient that nobody could figure out until the FBI found that he'd used a kid's chemistry uh, kit to come up with that one ingredient everybody had missed, so he went to a great length to find, as close to accurate as he could. He made errors along the way, which we look back on now, but generally, if he hadn't have started killing people, he probably wouldn't have been discovered in his lifetime, you know.
Yeah, that's it's an astonishing story, and glad we were able to kind of weave that into the thing. So, um,
But provenance, to answer your question,
yes, that's the
in other
biggie.
words, who owned this before? You asked me that question. As far as we can go back on something, and then with our knowledge of what a genuine piece looks like versus something that's been reprinted or done later.
Uh,
After 65 years of collecting, I've learned a few things anyway, so it's been
sure,
helpful.
sure. I remember one time I used to work at Borders bookstore, and somebody handed me a $20 bill, and I immediately knew it was a counterfeit.
Yeah.
Um, so is that kind of, do you have like that sixth sense where you can almost tell? Like you had mentioned that you actually had thought the salamander letter was a hoax at the beginning when you first read
Well,
it, just like Gerald.
I told
But
Mark it was and made him mad over that. Yeah.
but I mean, so are you able to, like, when you're handling all these
I, I
documents and
didn't
everything, like
I didn't base that on anything physical.
it was the text itself? Yeah,
Yeah, it was the text itself. Yeah.
right. But like, how keen do you feel you are at being able to I mean, like, you can sometimes just come across them and say, oh no, this isn't real, like whether it's the paper, it's the
Sure.
document. I mean, do you feel like you're pretty good at doing something like that?
Well, I'm getting better. Let's put it that way. Somebody that bought as many forgeries as I did 35 years ago, I can't brag about my knowledge, but I have. It's funny to me now that people in the industry will come to me to ask for, is this thing authentic or not? You know, and I guess it's just because I got burned so bad back then that I had to learn,
Yeah,
and it's been part of my long education process. I mean, it has been what, over 35 years since Hoffman
yeah.
bombing. So So we've all had to dig in and learn. And provenance has been a big part of answering your question. In other words, as far back as you can go. When I did the one on the Joseph Smith Bible, I gave you every owner going all the way back.
Mhm.
Well, we try to do that on every piece. Sometimes we can't go that far, but at least combined with the knowledge that we have of forgeries, reprints, and other kinds of things, we can make a pretty good guess.
Oh, wow, that's really fascinating. So, I'm really glad that you brought this piece today onto my program. Um, do you have any final words that you would like to talk about this particular item?
Well, I just think it's interesting that from a humble newspaper clipping, that the Book of Mormon has emerged as one of the great books of religion today.
Mm.
Like I say, last I heard there were over 150 million copies of the book that have been published, and I don't know how many hundreds of languages it's gone out in. Certainly not as many as the Bible, but it's getting there. So
Yeah.
so it's impressive. Uh, how small beginnings sometimes lead to bigger things.
Yeah, yeah, that's very true. That's really cool that you brought that on, and yeah, that was the world. That was kind of the announcement to the world of the of the coming of the Book of Mormon. So that's a very important item to have in your collection. So I just want to thank you so much, Brent, for coming on to my program today while we're doing this little series.
Mhm. Thanks, Steve.
And I just want to remind my audience to like and subscribe, and don't forget to hit the notification button to be informed when a new episode comes out. Hey, looking forward to our next little segment. This is great, folks.